think there we go.
Okay. Well, good evening everybody, and welcome to Politics in a Pub, COVID-19, social distancing and livecast form. We hope that we find you well. It's a very strange set of circumstances we find ourselves all in. So let's get to the chase. My name is Christopher Crouch and this is Seamus Carey. And we'll start off as we usually do by acknowledging the fact that we're meeting on Aboriginal land, pay our respects to its traditional custodians, past, present and future, and remind ourselves that sovereignty was never ceded. There's a clue here. Politics in the Pub tonight is celebrating the 150th birthday of Lenin. Lenin's legacy is global in terms of philosophy, revolutionary theory, the formation of states, and how states can actually be administered. Even at the time of his death, he was ubiquitous. The poet Mayakovsky, in his epic poem V.I. Lenin, written after Lenin's death, it goes on, there's 3,000 lines, but there's some good ones in it. My favourite stanza is, I've been up mountains with not even lichen, just clouds lying on its rocky ledges. The one living soul for hundreds of kilometres was a shepherd, resplendent with Lenin's badge. Lenin's everywhere, even in the most isolated city in the world. And we want to spend the next 30 minutes or so discussing why that's the case. Now we're going to approach it in a kind of Leninist way, and we'll be unravelling what Leninism might be in all its sort of manifestations. As a young man, Lenin loved Chernyshevsky's novel What Is to Be Done. And what he picked up from it, amongst the enthusiasm for revolutionary change, was the idea that a critical method of dialectical analysis is to compare the part with the general, to compare the specific with the universal. And we've tried to adopt that strategy for the talk this evening. I'm going to, or rather, Seamus will talk about Leninism itself, and I will spend more time looking at the man. So we're trying to build up a picture of the part, which is Lenin, inside the bigger general structure, which is Leninism. Now, partly that's because I was introduced as a child, growing up in a communist family, to Lenin as a phantom individual. I learned about him through pictures, through stories, and through that identification with the individual, then slowly learnt the complexities of his theory and his actual sort of social relevance. So, how were you introduced to Lenin, Seamus?
I started first with Marx and Engels, and Engels himself said something to the effect that the development of a child is an abbreviated form of all of human development and history. And I think also my personal ideological development was also an abbreviated form of history. So I started with Marx and followed the history, followed all the turns it took, and that naturally led me to Lenin, because Lenin is the man known to have continued the legacy of Marx and Marxism and take it to a higher level in accordance with new historical circumstances. And of course now we call our theory Marxism-Leninism. And I think it's an important question to unravel. Why do we call it that? What is the role of individuals like Marx and Lenin? Is all this theory just the product of their personal genius, their personal qualities, some magic powers they had to create these theories. No, it wasn't. It was because they took all the knowledge at that point in history and synthesized it into a unified system of thought that dealt with the practical realities of the political struggle at that time. And Marx began that theory. He created the theory of scientific socialism and Marxism, and then Lenin further built upon it in accordance with new historical conditions that arose in his time. And Lenin, at a very young age, recognized the significance of Marx and his theories and their relevance to Russian conditions. And even when Lenin was at university, he got expelled from Kazan University for becoming active in student radical groups. Then he had to move to Samara, completed his degree, and then he moved to St. Petersburg and immediately set about unifying all these different little Marxist circles into the League of Struggle for Emancipation of the Working Class, which would inspire others around the country to form similar leagues and similar organizations. And then, well, unfortunately, Lenin was sent to prison in the end of 1895, but continued working in secret communication with all his comrades, and in that period the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was formed, unifying all these different, mostly city-based or region-based organisations into the first unified Marxist party, or at least that was the theory at the time. Lenin put a lot of work into spreading Marxism in Russia because he saw it as the theory which should become the leading theory in the working class movement, in the socialist movement. And he saw the need for the socialist movement, highly theoretical, a lot of it at the time, purely theoretical. He saw the need to bring that to the working class movement and unify them as one force. And so he also put a lot of effort into combating competing ideologies and combating revisionist forms of Marxism, so-called, all different tendencies like neurotism, like economism, like the legal Marxism, and he always insisted upon the correctness of Marx's ideas and also the necessity to adapt them creatively to the circumstances.
Okay. You can carry on, or I can pick up from that if you want.
I certainly can carry on. So he was immediately such a major leading figure in these Russian organizations. So many people met him and instantly could see these qualities he had of leadership and his grasp of theory. And he knew the importance of leaders in the struggle and of making communists, or at that time they called themselves social democrats, into vanguard fighters, advanced in theoretical and practical ability. And he always stressed on the need to stick by your theory whilst also adapting it creatively to the conditions.
Okay, I want to pick up on this idea of Lenin's relationship to Marx, not just as a strategic one, which it was obviously, but also what were the strategies that he used, and why did he use the strategies, and how did he read Marx, and why did he read Marx? And the best way in many ways, of understanding that process is a short article that his partner, Krupskaya, wrote in the mid-30s called How Lenin Studied Marx. You can find it easily enough on the interwebs. And it's a fascinating glimpse into the processes of Lenin's thought. When Lenin arrived in Petrograd in the end of the 19th century, he astonished all his colleagues with his knowledge of Marx. And it wasn't just because he knew a lot about Marx, it was because, and this is part of this understanding of the relationship, the dynamic relationship of the part to the context. What he had done, he had deliberately disembedded himself from the cultural context of Russia. He learned French, he learned German, he studied Marx in those languages because not all of Marx is translated into Russian, but also because by disembedding himself from the cultural context of Russia, he was able to step outside it and then view that context, the context that he had spent so much time in, as objectively as he possibly could. So one of his strategies, and a very important one, is the objective assessment of the immediate context that one finds oneself in by framing it from the outside. Krupskaya makes the point that Lenin not only knew Marx, it wasn't simply a scholarly knowledge of Marx. What he did, he used Marx as a tool for critical thinking. And this ran through his entire approach to making policy, to building revolution, to education within the party, to disseminating information about the young Soviet Union to the world. It was about understanding that information was not knowledge. You had to take information, you had to put it into a context in order to give it a meaning. It's 1920 and Lenin rocks up to the Young Communist League's Congress. And he is still the irascible, didactic man. He doesn't dumb down for his young audience. This is what he said. Communism is not something learnt by rote, but something which you have thought about and thought out yourselves. If a communist was to boast of communism on the basis of ready-made conclusions without doing serious work, without understanding facts towards which you would take a critical attitude, such a communist would be a very poor one indeed. So it is not, Lenin's strategy is not to find something, hold on to it like grim death and repeat it until finally it has some value. What Lenin did was to find information, put it into a context and make it more than information, to make it knowledge itself. Krupskaya points out that one of his favourite French proverbs was, I'm not going to say it in French, because it sounds really ridiculous. But in fact, it sounds worse in English translation, actually. From out of the conflict of opinions comes truth. Now, if you can imagine Lenin sort of quoting this every time there's an argument somewhere, it must have been infuriating. But nevertheless, it's something that gives an insight into his endless sort of dialectical approach towards finding truth, trying to find the pertinent questions to ask in particular circumstances. Krupskaya said that what Lenin also did in his study of Marx, when there was a crisis, when there was a situation that needed resolving, was to say, I need to consult Marx. And he consulted Marx not in a way to find some kind of template, some kind of set of practices that he could overlay on circumstances, but to try and understand how Marx had identified the particular aspects of a general situation to understand that process, that critical process, and then apply it to circumstances that Lenin found himself. So what can we learn from Lenin's strategy at this point is that just as Lenin consulted Marx, so we can consult Lenin, not as a template, but as a flexible critical tool that we can apply.
So what I'd like to talk about next is another major reason why Lenin is so significant to us. Now, obviously he was the leader of the first successful socialist revolution and first leader of the first socialist state. So that in itself would be enough to make him so significant, but at the same time, we consider him so important theoretically, not just because of that, but because of the way he analysed new developments in the world, new developments in capitalism, and in particular, the emergence of a new stage of capitalism in the world, which he called the imperialist stage, imperialism. And this analysis of imperialism has so many consequences for so many issues and so many practical matters that it's only natural that we append Leninism to Marxism, because Leninism is the Marxism of today. It's because we still live under this stage of imperialism, and that's why it's so relevant to us. They said of Leninism, that Leninism is the Marxism of the era of imperialism and proletarian revolution. And in particular, Lenin showed why the era of proletarian revolution is also the era of imperialism. The development of imperialism sets the stage for proletarian revolution around the world. Now, although Lenin's classic text on this subject, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, I believe came out in 1916. So later, towards the end of his life, we can still go back and see in his creative use of Marxism throughout his life, we can see the beginnings of this analysis of new developments in capitalism with huge consequences for our movement. And we can go right back to the split between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks in 1902 to 03, when that took place. That initially only seemed to be about minor issues of discipline, but it quickly broke apart into all sorts of theoretical disputes. And essentially, Lenin analysed that the Menshevik faction was taking an opportunistic view of things. And that led to opportunistic theories of all sorts, not just of these matters of the structure of the party discipline and that. And so when it came to the 1905 revolution in Russia, the Mensheviks basically said, this is a bourgeois democratic revolution. Bourgeois democratic revolutions have always been led by the bourgeoisie, therefore this one must be led by the bourgeoisie, pretty much. And so the proletariat in this revolution should ally itself with the bourgeoisie. But Lenin instead analysed that the situation in Russia at that time was not the same as it had been in France in the late 18th century. Instead, the Russian bourgeoisie was very underdeveloped and very weak, and later we can see the analysis of this is because of the international situation, because of the beginnings of the development of imperialism. The Russian bourgeoisie would never become the sort of progressive class that it had been in Western European countries 100 years earlier or thereabouts. So he instead put forward the policy that the proletariat should seek to be the leading class of the revolution and should ally itself with the peasantry. And this was breaking this sort of dogmatic thinking that the Mensheviks were putting forward by just applying old formulas without considering the real conditions. And this became a major difference, of course, between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. And it shows Lenin's creative analysis using Marxism to new conditions which are constantly developing. And this would later form his analysis of the emergence of the new stage of imperialism, which is dying capitalism, essentially. It takes a long time to die, sadly, but we're working on it.
Okay, so shall I pick up from Lenin's sort of enormous contribution in understanding that the nature of capitalism had changed and that imperialism, whilst there had been colonialisation and imperialism before, as Marx had identified, it had now had a new form. So how is Lenin able to make pronouncements like this? How is he able to analyse the way in which new ideas emerged and the way in which new ideas were impacting upon the world? It's partly something that anyone who does social sciences now will think is pretty standard. At the time of Lenin, what he did was really quite radical. What he did was to pick up Marxist ideas about where ideas emerged from. They come from a material reality. And then once ideas exist, they then affect the material social reality that they came from. So there's a continual move, a dialectical relationship between ideas, the conditions that formed them, those conditions change, then alter ideas. Lenin's genius was in understanding this in a way that hadn't been fully understood or applied before. Now he expressed this, he built on Marx and expressed this relationship in terms of social knowledge and the economic system. Sometimes we talk about superstructure and the base. The fact that in the social realm, just as we get ideas from the natural world by interacting with the natural worlds, we learn about how plants grow, we learn about the movement of clouds by observing the natural world. So too, if we observe the economic base, if we observe the way in which our lives are governed socially, we can get ideas that come from that observation. Having picked up those ideas, those particular aspects of a general system, then we can apply them back again, we can test them. So a good way of approaching this, and I know that most people have been introduced to Lenin's three sources and three component parts of Marxism, but it repays a constant visit, just in the same way that the Communist Manifesto repays constant visiting and reflecting on. So too, this brief analysis of dialectical materialism gives us so many clues as to how Lenin works, and of course, because of that, into how we can work. So I'll read a tiny bit. I know sometimes reading too much of someone quotes is a difficult thing, but this is quite a straightforward passage, even in sort of language that's now 100 years old. Just as man's knowledge reflects nature, which exists independently of him, so man's social knowledge, his various views and doctrines, philosophical, religious, political, and so forth, reflects the economic system. Political institutions are a superstructure on the economic foundation. We see, for example, that the various forms of modern European states serve to strengthen the domination of the bourgeoisie. So what he's doing, he's analysing, he's taking out information and then applying it, as he says, as a powerful instrument to affect change. So it's not just analysis, it's not just perceptive analysis, it's not just identifying the parts in the structure, it's understanding the relationship of the part to the general, and then understanding how that can then be changed and altered, and how the dynamic relationship between ideas and change can happen. What Lenin did was to establish a system or to validate a system. These ideas have been around since the Greeks, but what Lenin was to do was to take them out of that context of simple reflection, as Marx had said, and use them as a tool to affect the physical world. And this is what we call praxis, this idea of the unification of theory and the way in which we act. And Lenin was convinced, and retrospectively we can say rightly so, that theory and practice have to go together hand in hand. He critiqued the obsession with economism at the turn of the century, the idea that the only way that you could affect social change was by arguing that workers should be given better wages. Lenin's position, and in retrospect we can see that, to concentrate purely on economics is to ignore Marx's understanding that economics was substituting for social relationships. We just concentrate on the economics relationship, then we're simply being absorbed back into a capitalist way of thinking, back into a capitalist structure. So there has to be ideas as well as action. They have to be linked together so that the individual, and it starts off with the individual emancipation. It starts off with the individual understanding how they are formed, how that formation impacts upon them, and how that network of ideas, that network of structures, whether they're physical or emotional or ideological, frame the way in which they act. Up until Lenin, political parties had really stayed within a bourgeois framework. Their task as they saw it, even the utopian socialists, their task as they saw it was not to destroy capitalism, but to make capitalism somehow work better. Somehow, if you just tinkered with the controls enough, it would turn from being a hideous monster into something that was tameable and amenable to social relationships. And of course, what we know is that that's not the case, and we know that because of Lenin's contribution.
And to that end of Lenin to put theory into practice and to unite theory with practice, he became the architect of the modern Communist Party. And this relates to what Christopher was saying about the real struggle, about how the struggle is carried out in practice. Of course, Marx too was not just a theorist, he was also very active, and after all he co-wrote the manifesto of the first Communist Party, the first Marxist Communist Party. But it is Lenin who, under the new conditions of imperialism and the imminent revolution, constructed the basic framework for what he called the party of a new type, which is the same sort of party the CPA desires to be. It is a party of dedicated communists, of dedicated leaders of the proletariat to carry out this struggle, to not be distracted by temporary gains or temporary losses. And Lenin, with his leadership, showed that ability through all the turns that the movement in Russia took. For instance, after the failure of the revolution in 1905, there were several years of very harsh repression by the Tsarist government, and they had to basically go underground but Lenin firmly put forward the policy of combining legal work with illegal work and doing whatever legal work they were able to do under those conditions, and not view this retreat the party had to take as a loss, but as just something that necessarily occurs in the long struggle for revolution. And he took it as an opportunity to further refine the party, further develop the party ideologically and practically. And it's during that period he wrote Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, which is a major theoretical work affirming dialectical materialism as the basis of all Marxist theory. So Lenin created this new sort of party, which we now call a Communist Party. At the time, as I've said, they used the term Social Democratic Party. But there were many, many parties calling themselves social democratic parties, which at the time meant socialist, all through Europe, particularly ones associated with the Second International. And of course, when World War I broke out, all these parties completely abandoned whatever they had left of their Marxist basis and turned to supporting their own governments in the war. And Lenin was one of the most vocal people in the world movement, coming out and opposing this and saying this war is an inter-imperialist conflict and the proletariat has no part in it other than to oppose it everywhere. And so this sort of new split in the international movement formed between these old social democratic parties and the new parties who were anti-war and generally supported Lenin very much. And these parties then became known as communist parties on Lenin's recommendation. He made the recommendation in 1917, and then the Russian party changed its name to Communist Party in 1918, and then the Comintern was founded in 1919 and made a requirement of membership that all the parties call themselves communist parties, so that what they are is out in the open. They distinguish themselves from these old parties, these revisionist, opportunist parties, and instead are highly disciplined, highly theoretical, with a strong grasp of theory, but also always viewing theory in relation to practice. And he also brought forward the policy of democratic centralism, which is still the basis of communist parties today in general, and generally the basis of the concept of democracy in a socialist society, where there is freedom of discussion, but unity in action everywhere. Because when you're in this struggle, there needs to be a high level of discipline in order to combat an enemy which is more powerful than yourself. So Lenin also elaborated upon the role of the party in society and put forward the idea that it must be the leading force in the revolution, and then later, under the conditions of establishing socialism in one country or just a certain number of countries rather than succeeding around the entire world immediately, the communist parties must remain the leading force in those societies in order to push forward the development of socialism and push back against this constant, both very literal and ideological threat of capitalism out there, imperialism.
Thank you. I'll do this last little section on left-wing communism and infantile disorder, and then kind of maybe that we can just toss Lenin and draw. Okay. So Lenin was as capable of analysing his own actions and his own successes and failures, just as he was everybody else's. And left-wing communism and infantile disorder, which again is easy to track down, does two things. It analyses the way in which the Bolshevik revolution both was flaky and successful, and that there are no punches pulled. And in analysing the particular way in which the Russian Revolution took place within the context of capitalism, he offers not a template for radical change, but strategies and observations about radical change. Lenin had no time at all for what he called phrasemongering and clowning, the idea of a performative radical, the idea that simply by shouting about radical change and observing the iniquities of the world, that's not enough. As far as Lenin was concerned, there had to be an intense structural analysis of the way the systems worked. By doing that, then, by asking those questions, by taking the component parts out and seeing how they worked, by looking at the relationship of ideas to circumstances, that is the way you understood how revolution could take place. He not only, in this text, he not only talks about the way that the Russian Revolution took place, he abstracted out from that a set of principles for revolutionary change. What are the circumstances that took place in Russia that could be universally applicable, no matter what the political or social environment that the radical found themselves in? And the second part of the text looks at the way in which radicals in parliamentary democracies could act in a revolutionary way. He had no time for people who removed themselves from political structures, whether they were political structures that were amenable or political structures that were oppressive. And when he's writing about parliamentary democracy, it doesn't come with a sense of I can't think of the word. Too much Calvados. It's your fault, Seamus. He wasn't sort of bestowing any kind of glamour on the idea of parliamentary democracy. Far from it. What he was saying, though, was radicals in parliamentary democracies who stand outside the political system are basically idiots. That the way in which parliamentary systems work can, to a point, be used to develop the moment that the conditions of revolutionary change can take place. And that to ignore the political structures that we find ourselves part of is to neglect a potential tool for change. So he has two key points to say really here, two key observations. One is about the way in which radicals who disconnect themselves from the immediate context that they exist in often fight battles they are destined to lose. And he, like Marx and Engels, he always uses Blanqui and the sort of the catastrophe of Blanqui's attempts to kind of change the political system in France. Premature violence achieves nothing. And as he says, to accept battle at a time when it's obviously advantageous to the enemy, but not to us, is criminal. So it's practical advice. It's about using Marxism as a tool to understand how we fit into the bigger structure. He also says that criticism, the most keen, ruthless and uncompromising criticism, should be directed not against parliamentary activities, but against those leaders who are unable and still more unwilling to engage in what can sometimes be a very boring reality, but to understand reality is to make it strategically advantageous and to make the potential for change even bigger. So there is more, but as always, we're running out of time. Do you want to add something to that point?
Yeah, I just want to add something about it is such an important text, Left-Wing Communism, because in it we see Lenin himself sort of debunk a lot of people's assumptions about Lenin and about Leninism, and it really shows Lenin's reasonableness and always practically minded, always responding to the circumstances. And it shows us the fact that we have to accept all forms of struggle. We don't say, we don't engage in that because it's not pure enough for us. We can't achieve revolution just by being pure, just by being better. That doesn't achieve anything. You actually have to create a real movement.
Yes, you have to create the revolutionary condition.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So again, his genius is understanding how particular parts fit into a system that works, whether we like it or not. And when I say works, there's no moral kind of functions. Thank you. There's no moral kind of endorsement of it. How a system functions. I'll just finish with more Mayakovsky. Time speed on. Spread Lenin's slogans in your world. Not for us to drown in tears, whatever happens. There's none more alive than Lenin in the world. And it's trite, and everybody says it, but Marxist-Leninism is a living science. Shall we toast them
I'll
out?
absolutely toast to that and to Lenin.
Yes, and to you. Hope self-isolation is fun. Bye.
Happy birthday, Lenin. I'm gonna have to. You'll get some bonus me because it's not ending.